So now that we know about Walter Benjamin's artwork essay, I want to introduce the case study for this week. That is the film Blow Up by Michelangelo Antonioni. I think this film is so rewarding that you can watch it 1,000,000 times and discover new things. I think you should watch it at least 2 times. That's my advice. But for those of you who don't have that amount of time to spare at this moment, I will use this second video to give you some pointers, what to look out for. And I think we should all engage in a close viewing, like the visual equivalent of a close reading, where we look out for all kinds of elements that we might expose to analysis when we meet each other again on Tuesday. So it is advisable to just watch this video and then watch the film or rewatch the scenes that I will point out to you as especially worthy of close analysis. So here it goes. So as with Her Story, it should be said that with Blow Up, the meaning of this movie might not so much be in what it is about, if that makes sense. So it is not about what it is about, with which I want to suggest that the meaning lies more in the manner of presentation and in the form and the technical aspect than it lies in the content of the story, which as you will see is quite slim. So Michelangelo Antonioni is a director who we can situate into the high modernist movement of European cinema. And last week, Susanne gave you this overview of the 3 waves of cinema. He is very much part of this second wave. He's one of those auteur directors. And Antonioni was inspired by the Italian neo-realists of the 40s and 50s, like Pasolini and Fellini. And if you remember what Susanne told you about it, they were often depicting the working class. They were shooting on locations for added realism, and they would also use non-professional actors. Antonioni's films can also be seen as depicting social critique, so delivering some critical commentary on society. At first, his films were mostly depicting the aimlessness and the lack of psychological depth and emotion of rich people. But later on, he also started looking into the working class, and he figured out that they were not much better. So his very negative, quite disillusioned view on people in general and sociality delivered him the neologism Antony Ennui, so his gloomy outlook on society. And his characters in films like L'Avventura always lack psychological depth. As said, they can be seen as visual surfaces among the other material surfaces and objects within the film. And Antonioni has also been critiqued for that, saying that he uses his characters as props. So in an interview, he himself has claimed, "I regard the performer as I regard a tree or a wall or a cloud. That is just one element in the overall scene." Blow Up is his first film in English and shot outside of Italy. It is very loosely adapted from a short story by the Argentinian writer Julio Cortázar, titled Las Babas del Diablo, which translates as The Droolings of the Devil, and in colloquial expression means something like a narrow escape from evil, which is exactly what the short story is purportedly about. Blow Up is a movie that is really about the process of making and experiencing film, so a meta film, in the modernist tradition like others, Bergman's Persona or Otto e Mezzo by Fellini. So Blow Up is set in London in the swinging 60s, which was a time that was marked by the emergence of advertising, fashion, magazines, models, the glamorous life. And the main character is a photographer named Thomas. He doesn't really have a name in the film, I think, but he is named Thomas in the screenplay. So for the sake of clarity, let's call him that. And he is not a very sympathetic character at all, I think. He comes across as very aimless in life, very bored, very self-centered. Nothing means anything to him. He doesn't treat his models very nicely. Some people see here a parallel with Antonioni. He is unreliable. We catch him lying at several points in the film and just fabricating unrealities, fabricating stories. When we look at his face, he's almost reminiscent of this actor that was an illustration for the Kuleshov effect, but this very neutral expression. So with Thomas, we are always trying to infer what he thinks about things or what he feels. It never becomes very clear. So you really have to project it onto him or read it into him. An important theme in the movie is distraction, and this is a theme that we also see back in the essay by Benjamin, who says that the masses are dealing with film in a very distracted way. So all the characters in Blow Up, in a way, are distracted. They're all often pursuing something, and then they strive after it, but when they get the thing, they immediately lose interest in it and just throw it away and start to do something else. So that is a definite theme. They're all in some way or another kind of detached from reality. They even seek to flee reality in the form of drugs or through travel. So they seek to escape. And one model called Verushka, who is played by herself, at one point doesn't even know whether she is in Paris or London. A theme that can also be summed up, I think, by epistemology. So it's very much about how can we know the world, how can we know what is real, what is not real through the senses. And Antonioni even said this in an interview, like, I'm really questioning the nature of reality. So Thomas experiences the world through his viewfinder, through his camera. He even makes love with the model at some point through the lens. So by visual proxy, we could say, and not the real deal. And it seems to be that he is in control over his own world as long as he has his camera to look through. So everything that he sees through his lens, he put there in a way. Everything is arranged meticulously according to his own vision. Like the models, he tells them exactly how to sit and where to sit. So the comparison with the film director imposes itself here. And as said, Antonioni is also famous for using his actors that way, as mannequins or as props. So important here is Benjamin's observation, if you recall, that in film, the viewer is put in the position of the camera and can only see from the perspective of the camera. So what that means here is that we almost never get to see what Thomas sees through his viewfinder. We rarely get his perspective of things. We either see things from a slightly different angle, or we see him in the view from the back. So what we get, in the words of Terry Peevler, is a photograph of a photographer taking a photograph, or, because it's a film, a series of photographs about a series of photographs. And the only thing that really surprises Thomas at some point is also what incites the action of the film, and that is something that he did not put in front of the camera. So he goes into a park and he accidentally stumbles on a couple, a woman with an older man, and they seem to be having some secret rendezvous. At least that's what Thomas's assumption is. That's kind of his narrative that he projects onto the situation. And then he starts capturing them on film until the woman realizes what he's doing and goes after him and says he cannot do that. So when he later develops the films, because he wants to know what the woman was so secretive about, he discovers what he thinks is a dead body. And at that moment, really a crisis of perception is unfolding. And I think we can bring Thomas's journey, and maybe also our own as viewers, into dialogue with Benjamin's rather utopian destination for technologically reproduced art. So as you remember, he based his belief in the political potential of reproductions or photography and film as presumably analytical media, as ways to analyze reality in a closer way. So when we take a look at the opening credits of the film, we see the letters projected on a green background, like the park, that will later prove an important setting in the film. And we can see a little bit of the screen action through these letters, like they are windows. So an illusion is opening up, it's about to begin. And the green of the grass is like a canvas onto which the narrative is projected. So projection is really a key element here. And also the letters are mirrored, we see a reflection. So this might suggest that what we see in this says a lot about ourselves in the first place. Right from this opening scene, certain contrasts are set up that will prove important throughout the film, only not in a very clear-cut way. So this is not a film that takes you by the hand, so to speak. We see a group of mimes and happy students, and these are juxtaposed to a poor house, a doss house. Besides his work in fashion, Thomas is also working on a book of photography in a more social realist tradition of poor people in London. So we see certain colors come back in the costumes. You have black and white versus color, and that is the same throughout the film. You should pay attention when this occurs. So we have the car, we have the nuns, we have the bright red guard, and please take note of other instances. So the same kind of dialectics we could see here, like we discovered in Eisenstein's theory of montage, for instance, but also in the films of Griffith. And obviously there is some kind of commentary made here. So one hypothesis could be it's a social critique, like the swinging 60s, where glamour is juxtaposed to the poor and oppressed, who suffer at the same time in the very same city space. It could also be a message about realism and fantasy. But what side is realistic and what side is fantasy? Do we align black and white with real? And this already might foreshadow that things are a little bit more problematic in this film, and that realism might be an illusion in itself. Because one of the workers, we find out, is Thomas, the main photographer character in disguise. So he turned out not to be a poor person after all. He just dressed like that to get the perfect picture. And also, this is an intertextual wing to one of the first projected films ever by the pillar of realism, we could say, Louis Lumière. And this is the film about the workers coming out of the Lumière factory in Lyon. So even the poorhouse smacks of fake from the beginning. And this homage could be also construed as a warning, namely not to believe your eyes when watching this film. So when we start to look into this theme of ambiguity, we see it everywhere. For instance, in the transparent plastic panels that the models are asked to sit behind, or in the political placards in a demonstration that can either read on or no. And then there's this sign that you see here on the slide. And this is also the last time that the Vanessa Redgrave character is seen in the film. So she disappears under this sign. And fans of Antonioni have extensively researched all the different locations and the different buildings that figure in the film and traced them in London. But there was never a shop front found at that time with permuted on it. Permuted comes from an Italian word which roughly translates as to change the order of arrangements or some form of transformation. So it's a permutation, pointing to the fact that what the photographer sees through his camera is colored by the camera itself, as also reflected by this quote from the original short story by Cortázar. So this should already point us towards a slightly different relation between reality and technological reproduction than the one that Benjamin was making a claim for, namely the camera distorts. Another clue can be found in the abstract painting that is made by Thomas's friend Bill, the painter. Thomas is asking what it is about, and Bill says it doesn't really work like that. It's most like a detective story. So once you have a clue, you have something to hang on to, and then it starts to become interesting or fascinating. Other clues that point us in the direction of what is real and not can be found by paying attention to sound. And in order to do this, you must know the difference between diegetic and non-diegetic sound. Diegetic sounds are sounds whose source is part of the action. That can also be slightly off screen. It doesn't have to be in the screen, but it should be on the same level as the story. So this can be most of the speech by the characters. It is sounds that are made by objects. When someone drops a ball, for instance, that makes a certain sound within the scene, which is diegetic. And then the music that is actually played in the story world. So as you might expect, non-diegetic or extra-diegetic sounds are then sounds whose source is not part of the action. So you can think here of an external narrator, a sound effect, something for dramatic tension that occurs when something really exciting is going to happen. And also most of the music in the film will be external. So Blow Up is a quite special case in this regard because almost all of the music is diegetic in this film, in fact, which doesn't happen so much. So it's beside the intro and outro that is extra diegetic music, but besides that, you mostly hear records that Thomas plays within his studio of Herbie Hancock, and there is a live concert by the Yardbirds that he visits. So in all these cases, the music is coming from within the story world, it's diegetic. But it is in instances where you cannot point to the source of the sound within the story world, and hence you have non-diegetic sound, that you should really pay attention. So this is another clue I'm going to give you. So to make the difference clear once and for all, first I'm now going to play the shower scene from Psycho, famous scene where extra diegetic or non-diegetic music is used to enhance dramatic effect. And then I will play a parody of the same scene from The Silence of the Hams, where music is definitely intra or diegetic. So another thing that we might look out for is color, as said. So as you remember from Susanna's lecture, the neo-realists were famous for using real locations. And we see that Antonioni does this too with London, only we might think of the neo-realist style, but there is a definite difference here. And that is that almost everything you see is purposefully enhanced by him. He famously went to the park, that is one of the most important settings, maybe the most important setting, and he painted the grass greener. And he also overpainted some of the houses, the facades in London, to have brighter colors than they actually have. So it looks like realism is some form of strange hyper-realism here that also is quite artificial. And then, most importantly, I ask you to analyze the so-called blow-up sequence, the series of enlarged photos. So Thomas definitely, in terms of Benjamin, wants to bring things closer to him in space. He is not respecting the aura of these pictures at all. He's not keeping a respectful distance. He destroys the integrity of the scene in the park by blowing it up. So he uses his photographic skill to reveal something about these pictures that have captured his attention. He wants to see more than the naked eye. And in themselves, these pictures don't have a lot of meaning. So he makes a sequence out of them, essentially like a series of shots that create a film. So any frame of any analog film is a photograph representing 1/24th of a second of real time. Like a still camera, the movie camera slices time into discontinuous fragments, we might say. So what he's doing is making a montage, a narrative film. And we literally see him standing in between these blow-ups. He is projecting the story onto them. He's filling the intervals between them with narrative causality. Each image, we could say, is pregnant in the sense of the Laocoon sculpture that we talked about. It is pregnant with its history and its future, whereas it's only a moment in time. So first, Thomas puts these images in a sequence, reconstructing the order of events, which is completely incorrect, by the way. He makes mistakes. And then he sees something in a woman's expression, so he enlarges and he makes a secondary blow-up of her face. And then he traces her eyeline to find out what she's looking at, which is essentially eyeline matching in editing. First, he creates a story, and then he discovers a fact that can only be a fact in the context of this narrative frame. So, like Benjamin, Thomas believes that somehow by blowing up the image more and more and getting into finer detail, reality will reveal itself. But what happens when you blow up a picture? The grain or pixels start to interfere with the contours of the object. Pay attention to camera movement and angle as well, because sometimes the enlarging is done by Antonioni with his camera and not by Thomas. And this is another form of indexicality that we talked about. Like movies can direct our attention to certain things. Like Antonioni wants us as viewers to make the discovery by ourselves maybe, or he wants to assert his presence as the ultimate puppet master who is controlling this situation. So when we get to the famous ending, Thomas is completely confused, doesn't know what to do with this murder anymore. And he stumbles upon some mimes in the park who are playing an imaginary game of tennis. And then they drop the imaginary ball over the court, and he picks it up and throws it back at them. Simple as that. And I really want you to come on with your own interpretation when we get to this scene, because interpretations completely diverge. People really get into conflicts about this scene. So with the end credits, we again get the green canvas, which is also the grass, but this time we see black letters. So the illusion is over. We can no longer peer through them. And at that point, Thomas vanishes completely from the image. So Thomas was also being manipulated. Antonioni is to him what he himself is to his models, putting them in all kinds of positions to get the best shot. So we have to ask, what does that make us as viewers? What does this tell you about our own perception of reality? So as with her story, we could endlessly debate the question, what has happened here? What have we seen? Was there even a murder? Thomas does see the victim at some point with his own eyes, as do we. But we also hear a tennis ball, and we see and hear Thomas, who eventually disappears. So what do we know? According to Michelangelo Antonioni himself, it is all a moot point. I quote, "A lot of energy was wasted by people trying to decide if there was a murder or wasn't a murder, when in fact the film wasn't about a murder, but about a photographer. Those pictures he took were simply one of the things that happened to him, but anything could have happened to him. Blow Up is a film that lends itself to many interpretations because the issue behind it is precisely the appearance of reality. Therefore, everyone can think what he wants." So now I close off by pointing out some intertextual relations with other films. A film that came earlier in 1955, but has some very interesting resonances with Blow Up, is Hitchcock's Rear Window. It is also about a photographer who has broken his leg. He is housebound, he is bored, and he is staring out of his window through binoculars. And he is inventing all kinds of stories for his neighbors across the courtyard. So he is making up love stories and mysteries and comedies, inventing all these characters and just projecting it onto the movie screen of his mind, so to speak, until a point where he actually witnesses a murder, or so he thinks. Both Rear Window and Blow Up are in a way a self-reflexive commentary about the art of cinema, and both figure male characters and very much are about the male voyeuristic gaze and imagination. So both, in a sense, are about the ambiguity of sense perception itself. A film that was clearly inspired by Blow Up is Brian De Palma's Blow Out, which is a film about a sound guy for cinema, a sound recorder, who is outside trying to capture some sounds. And at some point, he witnesses a car that accidentally drives into the water. So he is able to save the girl that is sitting inside the car, and a whole romance plot unfolds after that. But the other man in the car, who turns out to be a senator, dies. And then later, when the John Travolta character goes home to listen to the sound recordings that he made, he finds out that he hears a shot somewhere in the background. And from that moment on, he figures that there was a murder or attempted murder. And then lastly, and in a less serious vein, Austin Powers recreates the scene from Blow Up with the model Verushka, where Thomas makes love with her through his camera, with his own model, Ivana Humpelot. So a last interrelation that needs to be pointed out here is to a very much non-fiction event, namely the assassination of Kennedy that occurred 3 years before the film came out. In the late 60s, people became obsessed by proving all kinds of conspiracies about this event by going back to the original photos that were taken on the day of the assassination and blowing them up and enlarging them, enhancing them with the intent of finding, for instance, the presence of a second shooter. But like in Antonioni's film, only when you already believe that there was a second shooter can this blow up be considered proof for anything at all. Otherwise, it is just a blur. And finally, today, we have more advanced methods at our disposal to aid our unconscious optics in a Benjaminian sense. But here as well, I think we should be critical in determining whether these are in the service of truth or fiction. So I have two questions for you that we can discuss during our meeting on Zoom. The first is, in his essay, Benjamin compares a painter to a magician who keeps a distance from reality, whereas a cameraman is compared to the surgeon who brings reality closer. And with this in mind, would you rather call Thomas a magician or a surgeon? And what about Antonioni himself? The second is, what about the aura of photographic images and film? Is there a place for the aura in Blow Up?